So, let's talk about climate. I was going to start with a little bit of a joke about climate and climate change, but I figured since we're talking potentially about climate change, that's enough of an icebreaker alone. Thank you. I'm so fortunate to have a wife who loves me for who I am. Thanks for letting me get that out of the way. But that said, let's warm it up a little bit. I spent an unfortunate amount of time thinking about climate in a number of different ways this week. And there are a lot of different ways to go with this kind of conversation, and there are a lot of different ways in which we at GTech relate to this. But I was actually kind of hoping just for a quick round of, in one word, what does climate equal for you? What, in one word? It can be anything. Show of hands. Let me see. Go ahead and pop it out. Nathan, one word. What does climate mean to you?
What I feel.
Feel. I said anything works. That's fine. There's some G-Techers in the house. Climate, what does that mean to you? One word. Non-G-Techer. Okay. D. Fear. Well, that kind of nailed it for me. Zach. Trouble. You guys are doing great. Yes. Trends. Climate equal trends.
Future.
Climate equals future. Okay, good. And one more. Or not. Great. Well, I heard lots of things. Fear, trends, trouble. Climate equals many things to many of us. So it turns out that there's a popular phrase that climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. This is actually a popular phrase. How many of you are familiar with this phrase? 1, 2. I'm very relieved to hear that because when I was informed that this was a popular phrase, I was a little embarrassed. I've never heard of this phrase, but it kind of makes sense. Climate is a macro trend, weather is a acute micro event. So, hard not to sort of bring about this image, right? Hard not to think about our current lens of climate and climate change as warming, as fearful, as troublesome, as burning. D, you nailed it. Nailed it. Climate equals fear. I think in many ways, through the lens of our conversation these days, through the lens of public dialogue, climate equals fear, right? For a variety of reasons. And in fact, it's almost impossible to talk about climate without wanting to start talking about science, right? So you can imagine the many minutes of looking at Al Gore presentations and very important climate-related data of which many people in this city have helped contribute to and not want to talk about it because it's very, very important. It is what underscores and defines that fear and that trouble. It's very important, and I want to be really clear about that I don't necessarily think that that's what we're going to talk about today. So my assumption is that things like climate change are real. I'm going to make the assumption that most of the people in this room feel that way. If you feel differently than that, then I'm happy to have a conversation with you about that someday, maybe. But that's not the conversation we're going to have today. The assumption here is that we're all on the same page and that we can talk liberally about climate change as a real thing happening right now. End of conversation. Agreed? Thank you. And it's for this reason, because it is so underscored by fear, that I kind of hate climate. I am a pale male gringo from Boulder, Colorado, captain of the Crunchy Squad. And I hate talking about climate. I hate thinking about climate change because, in my mind, this has been something that's already been a part of reality for my entire life. So I hate having to justify and argue it. And I think that ultimately, in some ways, because it is so defined by fear, I hate having to think about it. And I wonder how many of us sort of share that mentality. And ultimately, because I think that we should expect more than fear, if climate is what we expect. So that's why I want to talk about relevance and resilience, because I think that there's some pretty important and basic social math here. So this is maybe a half a mile from where we're sitting. Unfortunately, this is on the corner of, I think, Meadow and Carver. I believe this house burned down less than 2 weeks ago. This is in between my house and my office. I pass this almost every day. So the question for us today, for people that are surrounded by this environment on a day-to-day basis, how do we start getting people thinking about climate as anything other than fearful, maybe a pain in the ass, and something that they have no control over? How do we start changing people's perspectives, including our own, but in particular people who have limited options to see not much more than this? How do we get people thinking about looking at empty spaces? How do we get people looking at waste? How do we get people starting to think about the opportunity for transforming place and having fun and doing healthy things and building community and connecting to each other? This also is about a half a mile from where we're sitting, maybe a little bit more, maybe a mile, in East Liberty. How do we get people putting their ideas into action and being aware of what their passion is and using that passion to connect to other people in ways in which they wouldn't have expected otherwise? This is a group of people in Bells Hoover that have turned a vacant lot into what is now a garden. So if people are products of their environment, how do we transform people's perspective of what surrounds them? This is an image of a field of sunflowers on Frankstown Avenue in Homewood. And it's the largest field of sunflowers grown in the city of Pittsburgh that we know of. We used to think at GTech that it was enough to activate a place, that it's enough to transform an environment, and that the very process of transforming an environment gets people involved in thinking about things in new ways. And so the prospect of transforming a blighted, vacant lot into a space bursting with sunflowers is a really bold and profound way of transforming people's perspective of what's around them. And that is true, and that's exciting, and that certainly clarifies the latent energy in places, right? Every place has the opportunity to inspire and change how we relate to that place. There's the cough. There's one. And so we started really thinking about, well, if it's not enough to activate a place, what else is part of that special sauce? What else are the ingredients that we can mix together? And one of the lessons that we've learned in the last 8 years of putting some of our own ideas into action is that one of the keys is giving power away. Every sunflower yields about 500 seeds. Those seeds, it's amazing. One seed yields one sunflower with 500 more seeds. It's a pretty profound thing when you think about it. And they require very little effort. So it's just a shout out for sunflowers, I guess. But so what we've learned as an organization is that there is a lot of power in giving it away. There's a lot of opportunity for unleashing the latent energy in individuals to put their own ideas into action. And so as an organization, we've thought long and hard around how do we combine the sort of positive energy associated with transforming places as well as enabling people to put their own creativity and ideas into action. A little bit of a parable and a story that's very close to where we are that I think sort of helps articulate this in a really specific way. There's a long preface for the word parable. Also right here we have a field of sunflowers also on Meadow Street in Larimer, maybe half a mile away from here. This was a project that we were very fortunate to be involved with. The URA contracted GTech 6 years ago to plant a field of sunflowers and to work with an emerging group of residents to be involved in that effort. And so for what was a photo on the screen is not as great as on my computer, but nonetheless, it's a pretty exciting development of having a blighted space transform and bursting into a field of sunflowers. Some of you may have seen some of these G-Tech projects over the years. So this was really good, and this was an exciting way of activating a space, but this was also an incredibly profound learning moment for us in thinking about what to expect and how to work with community from a climate standpoint. So this yielded a positive transformation of place, but what this really yielded was an incredible energy within a group of individuals coming together to continue putting ideas into action. And so the harvesting of these sunflowers brought 80 people from the community of Larimer together to think intentionally about how they want to utilize space. Some of you may be familiar with the dynamics in Larimer, and there's an incredible story to tell with dozens and dozens of actors and incredible success and victories and tragedies, and it's a really incredible and compelling story. This is one piece of that story. But what we learned is that energy of activating a space actually is a real energy, but it diffuses over time if we don't fuse it with an active network of individuals, and if we don't think intentionally about who among those individuals really wants to be moving forward and continuing to build out consensus with the community. And so it's a real honor to know that one small project of sunflowers helped bring together a network of people, and that network of people identified that land use and open space is the core value of their vision for redevelopment. That vision for redevelopment helped define a very real plan. That very real plan helped enable a large-scale investment for redevelopment and new housing. The story isn't quite that simple in all ways. New housing isn't always an easy and simple thing, but nonetheless, there is more investment happening now in this part of the city than there was before. That means there's more opportunity. It's, I think, a really interesting example of how small, tangible, incremental actions beget more action. And if we can be intentional about connecting those actions to opportunities for people, then we have a really, really exciting dynamic. And so, as I mentioned, this group of people may yield one or two people that also have the ability to continue building out energy and building out community health. So does anyone in the room know Carolyn Peaks? A couple of us do. So this is Carolyn Peaks. She's a Larimer resident. She has been a leader of the Larimer Green Team for 6 years, and she has been a key element in bringing the disparate groups in Larimer together to be intentional about how they preserve open space and green space, how building around green space actually creates the market that people in Larimer want that allows for both inclusive housing as well as new development. So it's people like Carolyn Peaks that represent this sort of translation of place-based energy and group energy into one individual. So, and it is those groups and Carolyn as an individual that help build out places like the Larimer Garden, which the field of sunflowers that we cultivated now houses 40 community garden beds, a bioshelter, a storage shed that they're looking to convert into aquaponics, a community gathering space, a children's play yard. This anchor of development has helped define new investment and new development in Larimer. And so, 6 years ago, this was there was more rubble than dirt on this parcel of land, and now hundreds and hundreds of people come here every year to build out and define what they expect from their community and from their climate. So, in many ways, it's certainly not a journey that's over, and certainly every peak is a plateau. That's a phrase I recently learned that I really like. And every plateau has a new mountain range behind it, but if nothing else, I think it's important to look at how actions beget actions and how those actions, when connected to people, really can enable an upward spiral of community investment. So that's what I mean by relevance. How do we get people thinking about what's relevant to them and adding it to what they expect? And in my opinion, climate equals community, right? So I really want to get out of this space where we think through climate equals fear, and we think about how relevance combined with climate equals community. So that's all good, but why make it relevant, right? Why should we spend our time on this, especially if it's very hard translating macro global affairs into our day-to-day life. Well, it turns out that when we make things relevant, when we take the energy involved in doing specific things that affect our day-to-day life, and we do that with those around us, it turns out in a very real way that fosters and enables a greater sense of social cohesion, right? It turns out that in a very real way, relationships help us survive. And so what I mean by that can kind of be illustrated in a good example from Chicago. In 1995, there was a catastrophic heat wave that hit the city. And there were two zip codes side by side. One had kind of a catastrophic level of fatalities, over 700 deaths in one heat wave. And another neighborhood, the city at large had 700 deaths. One neighborhood had about 40 deaths in that neighborhood, and the neighborhood right next to it had 3. One neighborhood was low income, one neighborhood was high income. Show of hands, who thinks the neighborhood with more deaths was low income? About half. So turns out that the neighborhood that was lower income had a disproportionate number of fewer deaths than any other neighborhood in the city. 3 deaths in that neighborhood versus 44 in the neighborhood right next to it, because people in that neighborhood knew who their neighbors were. They knew that Mrs. Jones down the street doesn't drive and can't get out of her house. They knew where the cooling station is. They knew that where the fire hydrant was. So there was an existing level of social cohesion that people who just simply had their air conditioners go off and didn't know what to do, they knew how to be ultimately more resilient in the face of that kind of external shock. And so it turns out that there's this sort of fundamental level of social cohesion and relationships that allows for us to cope better when there's an external shock, or even an acute external shock, or even a chronic problem that can be reflected through poor air quality, poor water quality, high rates of unemployment. And so this is kind of a gratifying thing because it sort of equates pretty well with that equation that I was talking about earlier, is that it turns out that not only do relationships help us survive, but if you look at this iceberg, which looks like a big tooth on the screen here, but if you look at the top of an iceberg, right, we all know there's much more under the water with an iceberg than above the water. But I kind of relate to it as that, a heat wave, an external shock, an acute shock, whether it's grid stability or infrastructure or any specific issue that hits us from an external standpoint, that's kind of top of the iceberg, right? There are strategies needed to make sure that we have cooling stations in place. When it floods, we need to make sure that people are moving to higher ground, right? So there are strategies to address acute, small, top of the iceberg issues. But the reality of it is that what allows for us to survive is sort of much more under the water and much more consistent regardless of the external shock. And at the base of that, at the very bottom, is social cohesion in our networks and our ability to relate to each other and our ability to depend upon each other. A lot of this isn't necessarily groundbreaking, but I think it's helpful perspective when we think about how to make climate relevant. And so from my perspective, all I would offer is that resilience plus community equals empowerment. And then we're having a conversation around how climate is not about fear, is not about trouble, is not about things that is beyond our control, but climate is about that which we choose to make it. And that in itself is a very empowering thing for us as individuals and for us within the networks that we work with. Oh. So I don't know if that was fast or not, but that's what I've got.